Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends. So glad to have you on board here at Life Support. This is a program that we tell stories to help you find a deeper relationship with Jesus through suffering and trauma. So glad to have you with us, and we're glad to have Ryan Alexander, who's the lead pastor of Hosanna Church in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And he's got a great story to tell. Ryan, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul.
It's really good to have you. And you are a pastor of a church here in the Twin Cities.
Yeah.
And you're kind of taking things in a new direction, in a direction that not many churches are willing to go. Tell me a little bit about your background and what kind of led up to you talking to your church about these important issues of mental health and so forth.
Yeah, happy to do so. I grew up, in a pretty normal kind of scenario with we were a church-going family and lots of love, lots of family-oriented activity. And so, I was, though, I look back on it now, a very anxious kid. There was a lot of anxiety there, and we kind of joke about it now. I was afraid of clowns. I was afraid of nuclear war. In third grade, I was in the counselor's office, talking about my fear of nuclear war. But I know now that there was definitely some generalized anxiety, a sense of the world's not safe. The world's not safe. And so I grew up, and some of that, of course, there's always nature and nurture. I think I was genetically predisposed to anxiety, but also, there was some environmental, experiential stuff that contributed to that. But it all came to a head in my late teens and early 20s where, and I didn't know what was going on, certainly in my younger years and even then, but it just kind of overwhelmed me. And I came to a point where I did attempt suicide twice, and one when I was 18 and one when I was 20. Both were triggered by breakups. I know now that there was triggering something deeper inside of me, but those were some dark times. And I'd be happy to talk more about how I made it through that, but that's kind of my story in terms of struggling with anxiety, mental health issues.
So you kind of carried this with you, and then when did you go into the ministry, and did you feel like you had to kind of hide that aspect of yourself?
Yeah, well, the fact that I ended up in ministry was one of the big surprises of my life, but it had to do with my story. 20 years old, I'm sitting on the floor in a hospital because of that suicide attempt and had to have my stomach pumped. I tried to overdose on a medication I was taking, and I was sitting on a hospital floor, and the therapist who was working with me had me look into a mirror and say, "Can you say I love you to this person?" I can't. I can't do it. And he said, "Well, can you think of someone that you really love? And can you picture that person and say I love you to that person?" And I was able to picture my younger brother, John, who was 9 or 10 at the time, and we looked somewhat alike. And so I was able to look in that mirror and say I love you to him. And then he said, "Okay, now what about yourself at age 9 or 10? Can you see yourself?" And I was able to do that. And then finally, was able to say it to myself at my current age at the time, age 20. And anyway, went to bed that night. Something had changed, but I woke up in the middle of the night multiple times, and I just heard this whisper, this audible. I heard the audible voice of God. Wish I heard it, all the time, but it's the one time in my life I just heard these words: "I love you. I love you." And I woke up 5 or 6 times. And that experience, the day with the counselor on the floor, and that night changed the direction of my life. And it's a journey that I've been on for the last 25 years or so. And so you asked the question about bringing this topic to our church. It was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, going on 6 years now. We did a series called Out of the Shadows. And the goal was to kind of begin to break down the stigma around mental health in the church. And it was just before, I should say, it was a couple of months before I was going to become the next lead pastor of Hosanna, which had only known one lead pastor in its entire existence. 35 years, founding pastor Bill Boleen, and I was the one that God chose, tapped on the shoulder to become the next lead pastor. So talk about trauma and going through a massive transition. Yeah. We could talk about that that some other time. But a couple of months before I became lead pastor, we did this series, and I really wrestled with, do I just share, everything about my journey, my struggle with mental health? And ultimately I decided to, and some of what I just shared with you, I shared with the whole congregation, and I had a bit of a vulnerability hangover the next day, but quickly got over that and realized, no, this is so worth it. And for me, because I felt like I had nothing to hide anymore, so that was very freeing. And for people, I received hundreds of emails. Normally after a message, you get a few emails, and some people like what you have to say, some people don't. But this one was thank you. This allows us to deal with some of the issues in our own lives, knowing that our own pastor, our soon-to-be lead pastor, also has struggled with some of these
Why do you
things.
think it's so unusual or difficult for pastors to talk about this?
Yeah, we're supposed to, a number of reasons. We're supposed to have it all together, right? We're supposed to be the ones who are modeling, health and holiness, and there is something, of course, to that. We want to be committed to that journey of health and spiritual growth and looking more like Jesus and all of those things. So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is the stigma in the church is, well, we should just be able to pray all of this away. Right? If we just pray hard enough, we just have enough faith. I think there's an implicit and sometimes not so implicit message that if we're not being healed of something, we don't have enough faith, which of course is not true. Faith is important, prayer is important, the power of God is important and central to all of this. But when something we say at Hosanna is that all healing is God's healing. It's all Him. He's made it all possible. And so part of that stigma is, sometimes the answer to our prayers needs to be the resources that God has made available, not just pray harder, pray harder, pray harder. That almost becomes a white knuckle approach to, mental health and struggles and healing. Instead, God said, no, I've made all of these resources possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like in James, the book of James, every good and perfect gift comes from above.
Right. Yeah. And there are resources out there now. And of course, there's been a stigma in churches for a long time about medication, therapy, and those kinds of things. And I would say, as a pastor, board members from a church can make a huge difference. If a pastor feels safe with his or her board and can share these things with them, because that's the group really that pastors live in fear of, would be maybe fair for some. But if there's not freedom there, they're not going to feel free to share to the congregation. So if you're a board member, man, let your pastor be who he is. Ask some questions. Take them to coffee. How you doing?
Yeah.
Very rarely do you get asked as a pastor, how are you really doing? And then when you get asked that question, you're not sure you really want to answer it.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what the consequences are going to be.
That's right.
So you took a big step of faith there.
Yeah.
Doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't regret it for a second. I always think, well, if we share this, people are going to think less of us, or they're not going to respect us as their leaders. But actually, I find that the opposite is true. That there's a deeper level of respect and just allowing people to see our humanity. Connects people on a human level, connects us with people on a human level that we wouldn't otherwise. So I do believe wholeheartedly that we need to share, obviously, there are details to every, part of us that, that we just share with some people, not everybody, but in terms of sharing the overall struggle with mental health and anxiety, I could not encourage pastors more to think about taking that next step toward doing that.
What would you say to pastors that are just not comfortable being the center of a sermon, or, this would be me, for example. I'm never quite sure how much of my story to share, because I don't want to be the center. I'm up there to help people understand more about who God is and so forth. And I know it's important that I share some of my story, but it's hard to know if you've crossed that line to making it about you.
Yeah.
And you know how some pastors stand up there and tell stories about their families, and on they go. And I don't want to be there. So how do you kind of work that through about how much of yourself to share?
It's a great question. And of course, there is a tension there that we have to manage. But Paul says, the Apostle Paul, and Paul, you've been in ministry longer than I have, you could probably quote the verse, but when he says that not only do we share the gospel with you, but our lives as well. That we are called to share our lives, and not just. There's definitely a tendency for some pastors to share. They make themselves subtly the hero, right? I have a tendency to do the opposite of that. So I have to watch, But I think sharing our real struggles is so critical, especially today when people outside the church already think that there's just some artificial quality to the church that they can't relate to. I think it's for people outside the church too. And the other thing I would say is ultimately we give glory to God. My healing journey is not about Ryan Alexander. It's about Jesus. I'm not here today. I heard God's audible voice that one time, but for the last 25 years, every step of the way, it's been Jesus doing what only he can do in my life, and me giving credit to him. I had early on in my ministry, I had a mentor say, our job is to preach and then duck, to preach and then duck, so that what people see is Jesus. So are we going to do that perfectly? No. But to risk the vulnerability, to risk sharing our story, people actually will see Jesus more if we ultimately point to him.
So you mentioned back in this time of your life when you were recovering from that suicide attempt, how dark was it for you?
Yeah.
And how did you work your way out of that?
Yeah, it was dark. I think the first time that I attempted suicide, it was more of a cry for help. The second time was, this is too painful. What I was experiencing, anxiety and the fatigue and the exhaustion. I think, looking back on it now, I think there were probably some trauma-related responses and dynamics playing out in my life too that I just didn't understand. So it was so painful. And not only was it painful, but I didn't understand what was going on. And so, I really felt like I was at the bottom. I was at rock bottom. I didn't know where I was going to go from there, and that's when God got a hold of me, thankfully. And He often does. I find with people have to hit rock bottom. Unfortunately, sometimes I think I did, and so. Yeah, it was a dark place. And how did I move through it? God's grace and Him showing up like only He can through people, directly, through the experiences that I had had throughout my life, learning about God. But I say that's when God dropped from my head to my heart in that moment and became very personal to me. But the other thing I would say, too, is I look back on it now, and that was a big conversion moment for me. But we also have lots of little C conversion moments over the course of our lives, and every step of that process. I just said it this weekend in a message. We just started a series on trauma, God and trauma, and I said that, be gentle with yourself. Healing is often a process. Sometimes people are healed instantaneously, miraculously, and that's awesome. I wish it happened for everybody, but most of the time it's a process, taking advantage of all the resources that God has made available to us.
I think we're trained kind of as believers to think that justification is that one moment, and then that's kind of it.
Yeah.
And that moment of justification is awesome and awe-inspiring and deserves our gratitude, but then the gospel is needed every day of our lives.
That's right.
Because we're never really going to be healthy. We're always going to be battling our sin nature. We're always going to be battling the infirmities of our bodies, the powers of darkness that are around us.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to continue to remind ourselves is that, this is a daily thing. And you're going to have days when maybe the powers of darkness are going to, they're going to take a little ground.
Yeah.
But, ask for forgiveness, move on.
Yeah.
Because we're all in this together, and I think this is what's so important about your stories. People sitting in these pews in our churches need to know that they're not alone. But I think they think they're alone, don't you?
Yeah, I do think that. And I totally agree with you, too, that there is justification and then there's sanctification. We're not going to, I've got a Lutheran background, that can get funky. We're not going to, go into that one big time, right? But I believe that, it's what Paul's talking about, working out your salvation.
Yeah.
Jesus accomplishes all that we need for salvation, and yet we are working that out over time. We say it this way, there is a lot of emphasis, some churches, say yes to Jesus. And that's great. But we really want people to say that yes after yes after yes after yes, which really is a daily yes, to Jesus and the work that He wants to do in your life through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. So how did your family react to this time in your life? What was going on around you when you were dealing with all this?
And when I was in my late teens, early 20s.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they, like me, were trying to figure out exactly what was going on. I know that some mental health issues are genetic, and so I think that's probably part of what I was dealing with there too, of generational, but not a lot of understanding. And so I think they were looking for answers, and obviously very distraught and hurting for me and for them as parents and siblings, and so it was a difficult time for our whole family, and in many ways kind of shaped the course of our family's journey from there too. Now in mostly positive ways, and so it was hard, and it is, and I would say that for family members who have a loved one or you have a friend who is struggling with mental health issues, that can be deeply troubling and painful and hard to figure out how to best support the people that you love.
I also find it to be isolating because there are many, many families that are afraid to bring their children to a children's ministry or to a student ministry because they don't act like other kids. There's triggers there. They're afraid that they might do something to alienate themselves. And there's very few ministry workers that really know how to engage that.
Yeah.
And so part of what I so admire about you is the more we talk about this in churches, the more we can prepare ourselves and help these families engage in the church, because having children who have even disabilities that are unseen are scared because they just don't know how to move into a church setting. Yeah. And so there's people out there that are just going like, there's no way that our family can fit in. Yeah. And that's sad.
Yeah. I think it's so important to normalize it. And also, I say, at least a couple times a year, I think everyone could afford to go through some counseling.
Right.
Every single person. Yeah. And if you think you're the one who doesn't, you probably need it more than anybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like we all need to work on some of the stuff. Some just have more than others because of nature, because of nurture. We have more to bring to that experience, but everyone has stuff. And so that's another way that we normalize it, is to say, this is actually an issue for everybody. Mm-hmm. And some just, more than others, but we all have some healing to do.
How have you found the pandemic to be regarding mental health and what you're observing around you and so forth? Yeah.
So again, I talked a lot about this past weekend, in the first week of our God and Trauma series, but I think I heard someone say a few months in, we're probably all going to have a little PTSD from this experience. And of course, there is actual PTSD, and we differentiate between big T trauma and little T trauma, and it's part. But the other thought that I've had about this past year is a lot of little T traumas can add up to a big T trauma experience, and I think that's been true. Also, secondary trauma, which you're probably familiar with, that hearing about trauma, seeing trauma over and over again can actually be traumatic for us, which also relates to your question about family members and who have someone going through serious mental health struggles. I would say this is going to have an effect on everybody. And the thing about trauma is it's affecting us, whether we know it or not. It's affecting how we think, act, speak. And so identifying it, naming it, being aware of it and how it's affecting our body, paying attention to how our body's responding to trauma, the impact of trauma in our lives, is super important. So I see it all over. I was talking to a teacher the other day, and she said, I think the kids have kind of been white knuckling it up to this point, but now we're starting to see some of those emotional, behavioral issues pop up. And I said, and it's not just the kids.
Yeah, that's right. And we're all leaders of somebody, and I think we as leaders need to have the awareness of that kind of trauma happening and really work on our bedside manner. When we're all walking through this together, we have to share information. We have to put up boundaries and so forth. But we need to do it in a way to recognize the fact that people really are hurting, legitimately hurting. They may not be showing it because they're individualistic Americans and they're not going to show you that they're hurting. Yeah. But it can be frustrating. And as church leaders especially, to look out at our congregation with compassion and love even the ones that are driving you crazy with no mask, or I won't come to church unless there are masks, and you go back and forth and all this crazy stuff. But the reason that they believe these things is because of something inside of them. It's not that they're trying to be difficult.
Yeah.
So love, I think, is so important right now.
Amen.
Which sounds a little cliche-ish. It sounds like the 60s. It sounds like we're on our way to Woodstock. Love is the important thing, man.
Yeah.
But, it really is.
Yeah.
It's
true. Yeah. Love for others and love for ourselves. Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And this year, the last 14 months have been hard for everyone in some way, some more than others. But we need to be gentle with ourselves and remember that God loves us and we can love ourselves too in the midst of these traumatic times.